Council on Global Affairs. I want to start by welcoming you all to Chicago. The questions have been absolutely amazing, and I know you put all the actual leaders on their toes. I want to thank the Atlantic Council. Fran, thank you and your colleagues for inviting us to support this. This has been a real pleasure for us, and we appreciate that. I want to welcome also the 125 Chicagoans and the one Chicago delegate who have joined us today. It's a thrill for Chicago. Local media has been saying, what's in it for Chicago? And we keep saying we're putting 125 Chicagoans into McCormick Place. So we're delighted about this. But really, welcome to the panel, too. I think this is the best panel. We've been hearing kind of, you know, the party line and the stories, and that's all very fascinating, but this is the real conversation. So let's turn quickly to that. The topic is responsibility to protect. And that topic comes out of an online conversation that our four delegates have been having. So we joined them midstream in this conversation. But just to put it in context a little bit, talking about the responsibility to protect obviously is it's about that, but it's also about what should the missions of NATO be as we look forward. NATO is coming home after about a decade and a half of being an expeditionary force. It has to begin to think about what's next, whether it focuses mostly on Europe and becomes a European force, or it goes global, or something in between. And how we think about the missions of tomorrow, whether it's responsibility to protect or something else or both, I think is key and is really what we're going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to turn to Hystrina Grozdanova from Bulgaria to start us off on this conversation, because in their conversation online, she's been thinking about maybe other missions to also be thinking about and how to think about this alliance in context. So we're going to start with her, and then we're going to move more directly and deeply into responsibility to protect. So Hystrina, maybe talk with us about how you're seeing the future of the alliance and to kick us off.
Thank you. So good afternoon from me. This topic really started as an online discussion. We were discussing about our agenda at the summit. And we were talking that so far our agenda really cover pretty much, the topics are pretty much the same as the topics of the bigger summit. So we discussed about what will be our input, what will be the day after the Chicago. Because yes, we see the sign that said Young Atlanticists. And that really means that if you want to be the Young Atlanticists and you want to be the next leaders, we really should act like the next leaders. I mean, if we start talking about the same and addressing the same issues of today and following the steps of our predecessors, basically we will end up with the same situation as they are ended today. There is a lot on the table to debate, but basically the debate is going nowhere. And then that's why I'm so happy that we had the opportunity to address this topic here at the summit. Yes, responsibility to protect, but then what's the next? At NATO Summit in Lisbon, we talked about NATO 2.0, and then today we don't talk about NATO 3.0. I mean, what happened? That was 2 years before, 2 years ago, and then something happened in those 2 years. And this is something that starts bothering me recently. I mean, basically for this summit, I had the feeling that we're dealing with the leftovers. We're dealing with what will be Afghanistan after 2014. That's good. We're dealing about the smart defense. That's good. And then we're dealing about the open door partnership or whatever. But then what will be after the Chicago? Okay, we'll wake up the next day, and then what will our life will be? We talk about a lot about Article 5, and then we failed to put the focus on something. Between Lisbon and Chicago, there was an anniversary that took place. That was 9/11 anniversary, and that's 9/11 was the situation where Article 5 was actually put in practice. Before that, there were several scenarios about the future of NATO, but after 9/11, there was just one scenario. There was a scenario about the protection of all the integrity of all NATO's member states, and then to address the next challenges in the fight against terrorism. It was good because the next 10 years, I mean, that was on the table. But then what's the table for the next 10 years? Are we still going to fight against terrorism? Is the terrorism the only challenge that we are going to address? I mean, those are some of the questions that I had in my mind and I wanted to put on the table. And because we had the 3 minutes time frame, I wanted to point out something. This is our panel, so I would rather hear more of your views on those topics than just answering questions, because we are here because of us, not because of, personally me as a speaker. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me turn it next to Andrea Baumann. Andrea, so you've done a lot of work on R2P. You're thinking about maybe what some of the criteria should be. How should we think about this in this complicated and evolving world? Carl Bildt set us up beautifully for this conversation when he laid out this is uncertainty. He couldn't have imagined just a few years ago where NATO finds ourselves. I know you've been thinking your way through that. So why don't you share that with us?
Sure. I think not only Carl Bildt, but the various interventions that we've heard yesterday and today, they certainly point to, it certainly makes sense discussing the role of NATO in the implementation of a responsibility to protect agenda. And partly because it is partly because of the existence of a powerful regional military alliance like NATO that we can even consider the practical implications of implementing the R2P agenda in the first place. And we've been reminded yesterday by the Secretary General himself what a formidable and unique military instrument NATO is. It's the only such institution that offers the tried and tested command and control structure that NATO has, a multinational planning mechanism and military headquarters, and the capabilities that are mostly American but also a few others. And so there will often be a temptation to use NATO. In a sense, it is almost too good a tool to rest on the shelf. And as the title of the panel is Problems and Prospects for NATO, as a good academic, I'm going to start with the problems and then see whether I have time for the prospects. And I won't go into the conceptual or normative legal aspects. I think BART will go into that in more detail. But I'll discuss 2 problems with the R2P agenda that have become increasingly clear in practice, particularly in the last 12 months, but also before with NATO's Afghanistan engagement. And both of these have implications for NATO as an instrument or a potential instrument to implement a responsibility to protect agenda. The first one is the uneven application of the doctrine, or I'm even hesitant to call it a doctrine, the uneven application or the uneven invocation of the R2P norm. It has been invoked in certain circumstances to protect civilians from government-sponsored violence, but it has not been acted upon in a consistent manner. The second problem I point out is the unresolved questions regarding the scope of this responsibility and the criticism that it has gone both too far in the direction of regime change and not far enough in the sense of failing to include a responsibility to rebuild in the post-conflict phase. Now, the first problem means that there is a real danger for NATO to be perceived as the instrument for Western interests whenever it is used to organize a response of the international community under the R2P framework. And I would argue that this is the case even if NATO is acting with a UN Security Council mandate. And that risk, to me, seems even higher if we are to assume that NATO in the future might operate as a framework for a few willing member states without the explicit opposition of anyone, but without the full support of the membership as a whole. And it has become more difficult to achieve consensus within the alliance of when to use force and what to use it for. And generating that buy-in has become more difficult, both with membership, but also with a change in the nature of the missions that NATO is undertaking. And the R2P agenda, in my opinion, has not provided a sufficient basis to foster that consensus in the face of diverging national interests, threat perception, and different strategic cultures. The second problem regarding the scope and of the military operation on the basis of that mandate to protect the civilian population. As I mentioned, the intervention in Libya, for example, has shown that the criticism can be both that the operation goes too far in pushing for regime change in order to protect civilians, and the mission doesn't go far enough because it ends at a point where civilians are no longer being attacked and killed, but the overall situation remains highly volatile, and there is a danger that the narrow military objective fails to lead to greater stability and security in the medium to long term. So I'll just take the last minute or so to go into the prospects. So what to do about this? And I would like to highlight two areas in particular. I think in the first one, NATO has done a pretty good job with regard to the Libya operation, which is to clarify the condition under which NATO is willing and ready to intervene in the name of responsibility to protect. We've seen the demand for a UN Security Council mandate, for regional support, but I think there is still scope for further debates on what the threshold of buy-in and consensus within the alliance itself should be with regard to a mission like that. The second area where I think there is actually a lot of scope for improvement is to clarify the scope and time frame of these NATO-led missions or NATO-supported operations and the type of capabilities that are required to carry them out. And how much capability does NATO want to build in its own ranks or its own architecture to do that kind of missions? And if the answer is very little, then that leads instantly into a serious reconsideration of the notion of partnership. And we've heard a lot about this notion of partnership in these last 2 days. And, but I think what we haven't really touched, or what we haven't really heard, is how to, in practice, consider the costs of building meaningful partnerships, and not in the sense of a shotgun marriage in the face of crisis, but durable ties that can be activated during a crisis without having to be created first. So if you wanted to put it in very simple terms, building partnership in a crisis is a bit like if you go on a rainy and cold, miserable camping trip with a person that you just met. And that might not bring out the best in either of you. And instead, I think partnership should be based on regular and steady cooperation. And that comes with a price tag that hasn't really been discussed despite all this, the floating of this notion of partnership. And I think we heard from the Slovak foreign minister today something very relevant about the notion of partnership, where he said that partners must be consistent, reliable, and predictable, and they should focus on areas where they can add real value. And I think that applies to NATO as well in its partnerships, both with other organizations like the European Union, but also with individual countries. And I would finish by saying that in order to be a good partner, NATO needs a clear vision of the type of mission that it is ready to lead, and also needs to know where it prefers for others to be in the driving seat.
Great. And for the others in the audience, maybe begin to think about Andrea's question about the kinds of missions that NATO should be preparing for now, in your view. And you can bring that up in discussion in addition to kind of a Q&A. So I would urge you to entertain that question at least. Originally we were going to go to BART, but I can't help but going to DUSTIN DEHEZ next, because Andrea's kind of put out this question about whether NATO is just too good a mechanism or a tool to leave on the shelf. And I know that's something that you've been thinking about in terms of R2P. What are the right tools that diplomats have at their disposal to engage? So if I could jump to you to pick up where Andrea left off.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you for having us here today. I'm going to be very quick, actually, in talking about the R2P and the potential implications for NATO as an instrument. But two general remarks I'd make. The first is the R2P is often being discussed as a tool for humanitarian interventionism, and that comes with the increasing risk that we talk about the R2P basically on that premise. However, the R2P basically rests on three different pillars. The first is that the responsibility to protect basically means that the responsible partner is the respective member state of the United Nations. He is responsible for the protection of civilians. The second pillar is actually the pillar where it says if the partner fails, then the international community has a duty to assist. And only if that fails, there is actually the third pillar, which says there is a humanitarian intervention possibility by the international community through a mandate of the United Nations Security Council. However, having said that, The United Nations Security Council resolution for the intervention in Libya, 1973, does nowhere make a specific reference, pays a specific reference to the R2P itself. So that is a general problem. We're talking about a norm that isn't very well established by now. Second point is, there is actually a fourth pillar in my view, which we don't talk about enough, and that is, once we do intervene, we assume a responsibility for the aftermath, and that aftermath might be very, very tricky, as for instance in Libya it is right now. And I think we don't pay enough attention to the potential consequences of that. Now, having said all of that, and finally coming to my second point, which is NATO as an instrument, I do fully agree NATO is a perfect instrument, but it's not a perfect instrument, it's a good instrument, in the sense that it is perhaps the best instrument we have at the moment, and I fully concur with Andrea on that. However, having said that, it's also an instrument because it's sort of, caught in a Hotel California situation. You can check out, but you can never leave. And that's basically NATO's role in the international community by now. That doesn't mean that NATO is the perfect instrument in addressing those questions. As a matter of fact, I think if you look at all the different organizations, regional organizations at the moment, doing this sort of interventions, there are quite a number of surprising developments. The United Nations, for instance, has had quite a remarkable success in the Congo. The African Union has a remarkable success, surprising resilience shown in Somalia. So I think the real instrument in making that work is actually a coalition of various organizations, like in Libya, where we have the Arab League and the GCC and NATO. And that's going to give us the legitimacy we actually need in order to make that a real and sustained effort for NATO to succeed. Now, having said all of that, I think it's also important to remember that NATO is actually an alliance that has, in its strategic concept of 2010, outlined that its most important responsibility is the territorial defense of its member states. So I'd like to raise the question whether or not we should prepare for that and then talk about what we can do on the R2P and perhaps help and assist the United Nations in making the R2P work. But it's also a question of priorities, and I don't think that we have all the priorities right now in the right order. So I leave it here and happily serve as your hostage from now on.
BART SZEWCZYK, I'm going to turn it to you. I know you've been working on a lot of these legal issues. So we have on the table the beginnings of the criteria being laid out by NATO about when it will engage in a humanitarian intervention such as Libya, that it needs the UN resolution, it needs those on the ground calling for it, it needs partners who who are calling also for them to come in addition to those inside the country. What are you thinking about in these terms when you think about R2P in the context of NATO?
Well, exactly. I mean, the responsibility to protect doctrine is actually very recent. It was proposed in 2001 by a private commission, an international commission, but essentially of private lawyers and foreign policy experts, headed by, among others, Gareth Evans, and involved a number of prominent figures. And the proposal was relatively simple. As Dustin mentioned, that the primary responsibility to protect civilians lies with the sovereign government, but in times of crises, which is really when R2P is relevant, because if there's no atrocity or no problem, then R2P doesn't really kick in. But in terms of crises, there's a responsibility on the part of the international community to prevent or to stop mass atrocities from happening. Those require UN Security Council resolution, at least in the current formulation. And basically, all the criteria, I think, are more or less set out there. So the atrocities that are involved are genocide, extermination, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And there's an extensive jurisprudence on what is triggered or what is meant by these concepts. And so I don't think that the main progress will be on this front, and further clarifying and specifying what these things mean and when R2P is triggered. I think R2P, the future of R2P is really domestic. In the United States, there's pretty good commitment, at least on the part of the Obama administration, to making R2P work. But I'm actually not sure that that's the case across the international community, and we saw that in Libya. The resolution, I think, actually does refer to every sovereign state's responsibility to protect its civilian population, and the Gaddafi regime having failed that. But then, as we saw in the debate, a number of NATO countries were very lukewarm as to whether they had an interest in actually participating. And I think the way the US debate has worked out thus far is that this is not an act of charity, but it's actually in the US national interest to implement R2P. I don't think that's the case in all other countries, all other NATO member states, and I think the future progress of R2P will be how those domestic debates play out, and it's actually fora like these that are much more important, and then conversations back home, during elections and so forth, during actual crises, to put pressure on policymakers to live up to their rhetorical commitments. The second point I'd like to make is that an even bigger future of R2P is actually not in punishing and killing war criminals or in stopping mass atrocities once you've reached 10,000 deaths or 800,000 deaths in the case of Rwanda in 1994, but actually preventing these things from happening in the first place. And again, the US administration has taken the lead on this in establishing the Atrocities Prevention Board. And basically the idea is relatively simple, and that is to elevate this issue to the high list of the agenda items for domestic policymakers, right? To provide for facilitating mechanisms so that not secretaries or ministers on a day-to-day basis meet on this issue, but assistant secretaries of state and defense and treasury and so forth do meet on this issue on a regular basis. Second, to provide greater intelligence capabilities in terms of anticipating where mass atrocities might be happening, and actually the National Intelligence Council is tasked with producing the National Intelligence Estimate, which is a consensus document of the US intelligence community on this issue, and to keep track of trends and to figure out how do you find out when which country, which area is ripe or is tending towards mass atrocity. And then finally to have a select sort of toolbox of options that you can deploy, military on the far end, but diplomatic on the front end, financial sanctions and other things, to try to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And I mentioned this briefly to General Gabriel yesterday, that NATO would actually be a very good forum to host a similar Atrocities Prevention Board and to really serve as the starting point to have similar institutions throughout NATO member states, so that when another Libya happens and the case for intervention is relatively clear and we can do something. Syria might be different because it's just such a much more difficult issue, but where we can do something, where we can prevent mass atrocities, that people actually think it's in their national interest to do so. Thanks.
Terrific. Christiana, I want to come back to you one more time. Then we're going to come to the audience. But I think we should be thinking about this in the context of obviously Libya, but Syria. Syria right on the Turkish border. What does that mean for NATO? So I also invite you to be taking some of the things that we're hearing and invite you to your thoughts on that. Christiana, just coming back full circle, in Lisbon we began to lay out what the kind of that's collective defense for NATO, but it's crisis management, it's preventive defense. Coming back to what you were saying, is it fair then? Is it fair to take your views and say that you worry that maybe in thinking about crisis management and preventive defense, you're worried that the alliance may lose its integrity about collective defense? Or how would you couch your thinking in terms of what we took away from Lisbon?
Yeah. So it's something that bothered me. We talk a lot about partnership, about enlargement, but then when we address this question, we never address the second part of the question, which is, yes, the bigger alliance, which will mean a bigger territory to defense. And then it will be much more harder for the member states to achieve a consensus on a certain topic. And then that's put a bigger question mark on the future of the alliance. I will make a parallel with the European Union. I mean, the Union has been there for more than 50 years, and then the founding treaties has been changed several times in the years through various reasons. And then with the alliance, the treaty has been signed in 1949, and then still today the treaty hasn't changed at all. This could mean both that it has been put so perfectly well, so doesn't need to be amended, or it could mean also that the member states are not ready to start to amend the treaty because they know that if they want to amend the treaty, it will be really hard to achieve a consensus on the new articles they want to put in. And that's why now we have these debates about is cybersecurity a national security threat? Can we activate Article number 5? But those questions, they become more and more important because once we've done with the leftovers from the Lisbon summit and then now on the Chicago summit, then the big question about the future of NATO will be even bigger. And then we should address it. Where is NATO 3.0?
So I welcome your thinking on anything on R2P in particular, or also as NATO comes home, what should it be thinking about in terms of what comes next? So why don't we start right over here?
Thank you very much for your kind words and informative discussion. My question is, it's kind of, Dustin, you mentioned that in order to build legitimacy for NATO operations in R2P, we need to have partnerships. And Andrea, you also said that partnerships can't be formed overnight, that it can't be like a camping trip and you just met the person. So my question is, to what extent is this building of partnership relations predicated on the fact that NATO will not only be willing, but also able to participate in R2P operations? What I'm basically getting at is, given the current fiscal difficulties and given the current reluctance of certain member nations to get involved in R2P operations, or even military operations for that matter, to what extent is NATO kind of being like a business that is going and forming a contract with another company or another business, but has no real intention of actually carrying it out? So my question is, to what extent is the relationship that NATO has to build with other partner countries or partner organizations predicated on the fact that NATO is going to be able to 10, 15, or 20 years down the road going to be able to actually carry out its R2P mission should the need arise? Thank you.
Does any one of you want to take this? Because there's a lot of questions on the floor, and I worry if everybody tries to answer it, we won't get to any of the other.
On partnerships, NATO already has partnerships with, for instance, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, Mediterranean Dialogue. I think the fact that in Libya we saw the active participation of a number of countries from the Middle East actually is the payoff from these partnerships. So we have seen a real advance in that and a real gain for NATO in that. So I think NATO, without knowing that the Libya intervention was on the horizon, actually did the right thing by default. So that's pretty good development, but it's also a reminder that we have to keep the capabilities that we currently don't have. And smart defense, in all honesty, is not going to lead us to do more with less. We're going to do less with less. And the question is, how much are we going to do or going to be able to do in the near future? And I tell you honestly, if we talk about R2P and humanitarian interventions, and as I said earlier, we might have to assume the responsibility for the fallout after an intervention. That is going to address a different set of capabilities than, for instance, territorial defense would address. So that's basically a huge challenge, and I'm not so sure that NATO is actually well prepared for that. So I'll leave it here and go back to you.
So let's take these two questions in a row, turn it back to the panel, and if we're really short about, if we're really concise, these two back to the panel, and then off we go.
Okay, my question actually picks up from the previous question. It's mostly about the legitimacy and the possibility that mostly R2P would be provoked by an out-of-area, the need for out-of-area operations, and then the question of legitimacy comes in. Specifically on the question, could it be that preserving a formation such as ISAF down the line be used for R2P operations? Because right now there's a talk of essentially phasing out ISAF, closing ISAF, returning to NATO proper overall. And yet there are always times when you need to respond to R2P situations, and you have to have legitimacy much bigger than the Atlantic, the transatlantic connection.
Thank you. And can I grab the question right behind you?
Sure. My question was about, as NATO was designed as an alliance in a polar worldview, obviously in opposition to what became the Warsaw Pact, And considering that the European Union doesn't have a unified military force, is NATO sort of doomed to be a Western military power, or sort of an aggregate Western military power, considering that there is little else to serve that purpose?
Thank you. Do you want to?
I can take the second question. So I don't fully agree that Europe doesn't have its own army, or put it in that way. Actually, we do have, the European Union has his own. But then the question about is probably it's more about the transatlantic relations. It's not about NATO defending the European Union as such, as an integrity union. It's more about the partnership and the cooperation between the two organizations. It's more about not defending the member states of the alliance that NATO defending the European Union as such. So I'm not fully agree with your statement. And I think that the future of NATO alliance could be defending the integrity of the alliance as such. That's the future of NATO for me.
Bart, can I bring you in?
Yeah, on the question of legitimacy, I think the model has been demonstrated during the Libya intervention. Essentially, you get Security Council support, you get regional actors to support you as well. And a lot of times, really the legitimacy in these operations flows from both, is there an actual atrocity that's happening and that you're trying to prevent, or to stop, or to prevent? And B, are you successful at doing it? So in Kosovo, there was no Security Council resolution authorizing that intervention, but in the end it was deemed to be legitimate because there was a real crisis and because it worked. So long as those two elements are at the forefront, I think the legitimacy question will be satisfied. And just a brief point on the cost of these operations and whether NATO can do it. Read the article by Ambassador Dalder and SZEWCZYK in Foreign Affairs. The Libyan operation was actually relatively cheap. The U.S. spent $1.1 billion on the whole operation, and the rest of the NATO countries several billion more. But these things are not, several decade-long commitments. And it's important, I think, to clarify the interest. And the interest here is preventing mass atrocities or stopping them from happening. I don't think that necessarily translates to rebuilding a country or raising its GDP per capita or any other noble goals. This is a limited interest that's been specified within RTP.
Andrea, I'm going to ask you to hold on. I know you've got a lot of thoughts to this, but I'm sure you'll have even more thoughts to these two questions coming from over here.
Thank you, guys. Very good talks. Having been in a law faculty for the last 6 years, I've read and heard a lot of international lawyers being very unimpressed by R2P because it doesn't change much about the law, which is true, but it's also beside the point. So I appreciate the corrections. It is, of course, a moral and political set of principles. And as Bart and Dustin also point out, it starts with, it is a set of principles of domestic policy first, and only in the very last instance, doctrine of intervention. Although I should add, one of the authors told me that although they didn't feel it politic in the original pamphlet to write that regime change, explicitly, it was implied. It was implied, certainly when it comes to the extreme case of preventing and stopping genocide. Now, what's most interesting, because it is a moral and political doctrine, it is really driving reform at the United Nations. And that's one of the most interesting developments, especially in the last 3 years, with great support from and leadership from Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And several delegations, including that of the Netherlands, and are determinedly pushing and using R2P as a principle and as a brand to make changes inside the UN.
I'm going to have to ask you to get to your question really soon. Thank you.
I'll finish soon. If you guys are interested, by the way, July there'll be a debate on this in New York. My question is, do you think that R2P could be used in NATO in a similar way to drive reform or to drive strategy when it comes to partnerships and enlargement, and maybe also other organizations, in a sense, what place could the OSCE have, or in what sense, how would it affect, for example, the external posture of the European Union? Thank you.
Thank you. And could I invite you to add your thoughts, please?
Hi, I'm Vanessa Bernick from the University of Chicago. My question is sort of about, what you've all kind of touched on, how humanitarian operations often seem to have a follow-up component in countries where the situation doesn't go as well after that humanitarian intervention happens. And you said, that the Libya intervention was relatively inexpensive. I guess, though, if NATO actually becomes an organization designed to deal with responsibility to protect issues, and it intervenes in a country, and that country devolves into, say, civil war, what is NATO's responsibility in that situation? And the type of military force necessary to rebuild a country or deal with civil war is very different from the type of force needed to, stop someone from committing genocide. And is NATO really ready to become the type of organization that has that sort of rebuilding capacity that is very expensive and very different than the military capacity it currently has?
So let me ask you to throw in your last question too, so we can be inclusive here, and then we'll finish up.
So I have a very brief question. About 2 days we are speaking about the smart defense, and so we try to explain what kind of angle is the smart defense. It's military, economic, or a political one. The smart defense, the main idea of smart defense, as the spokespersons are speaking, is to set priority, to support, to work together, and to make a specialization. I have a question. Is there a threat, the smart defense, to encourage country grouping in the frame of geography and to cause intergroup competition between NATO member countries?
Great. Well, the good news is you have a whole nother day to discuss all these issues. The bad news, we're going to be out of time. So, Andrea, you get the last word, and you've got a lot on the table. You get to choose from.
I'm not sure it's a good idea to finish with ISAF, but I will. Because both the lady's question and Hazib's question sort of pointed to, what lessons can we learn from NATO's experience with ISAF? And I think there's a more positive end and a more negative end to that story. On the positive end, clearly, there are a lot of lessons learned within NATO in terms of interoperability in a multinational mission that have come at a great cost and that should not be lost. So I think I would agree that there is a sort of there's grounds to think about where is ISAF going, where do we take these lessons, how do we take these lessons forward. On the sort of less positive end, I think ISAF has also shown that NATO has struggled all along to have a coherent narrative. And that is, in my opinion, just as important as to have interoperability. And it's in that sense that I often find that this reference to NATO as an instrument or a tool is a bit too mechanistic. It is not just an instrument or a headquarters. It has to have a vision. It has to have a narrative and a strategy. And I'll finish on that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our day. I think obviously we could go on a lot longer, and so to the Atlantic Council, next time we could do 90 minutes on this topic. But please join me in thanking the Atlantic Council in particular for a terrific day. And thank you to the panelists.